We're good. So today we're going to have a conversation with Sam Simmons. Sam's going to introduce himself. Sam is a man with a wealth of knowledge and understanding when it comes to this concept, this idea that we know as trauma, especially as it pertains to Black folks, Black Americans who have slavery in their lineage, or what's commonly talked about today, which is American descendants of slaves. Have you heard that term, Sam? American descendants of slaves?
Yes.
So it's been picking up a lot of steam, and there's definitely a political push around this. You know, it's not just a hashtag; it is actually an actual movement, but it's definitely been getting a lot of traction. So that's what we're going to be talking about today: is how trauma across the lifespan impacts of historical trauma. Sam, do you want to introduce who you are, where you come from, your background, all that good stuff?
Well, again, I'm Sam Simmons. I'm a licensed behavioral consultant, and I do a lot of work around culturally sensitive, trauma-informed work, working with particularly African-American men of color, and the African-American community around the issues of trauma, historical trauma. Do some work in the area of adverse childhood experiences and trying to put a cultural lens on that particular concept as well. I've been doing this work for almost 30 years in some kind of capacity. I also have a background in chronic pain, helping people deal with chronic pain. I did that for about 20 years. And in doing that for 20 years, I realized that my clients were primarily white. And then I was also doing stuff in the community, and I started noticing that the big piece in both of those experiences was folks weren't able to deal with early trauma in their lives. And so once I started primarily working in the community more, I started taking it to a whole nother step, and we'll get into that more as we go. I'm also the co-organizer of a conference called Community Empowerment Through Black Man Healing. We celebrated our 10th year last year. And in June of this year, we'll have our 11th annual. And we'll be talking about Black families.
Awesome. All right, so let's get into the rest of the content for the day. So tell us about this quote here by Maya Angelou.
Well, it's almost self-explanatory, but I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. People will never forget how you made them feel. And that's very true when we're talking about trauma. You know, it's, you know, we can talk about you know how you have people say, I love you, and everything they show you doesn't feel that way.
Right.
You know, so if your word, it's really about do your words and your behavior match what you're saying to somebody, in my book.
Yeah. And that kind of goes along with cognitive behavioral therapy. Like the whole concept of cognitive behavioral therapy is having your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions all match and go together, which is something that a lot of people struggle with when they're going through mental and emotional health issues, is that their thoughts don't match their feelings don't match their actions, and etc. Right.
And, you know, it's like working with the guys and asking them, do they respect themselves? And, you know, and I don't know very many people who will say, no, I don't respect myself. And then my response to them, but I can't tell by your behavior, you know, and sometimes that really shakes them, you know, when we have that deep conversation. So.
Wow. Yeah. It's pretty deep. All right. So African-American trauma experience. Who is Colonel Frank S. Nickerson?
He was a Union Army officer who had never been to a Southern plantation. You know, we don't know if he felt any deep sympathy for enslaved Africans in a sense, but he's seen enough humanity in them to come up with this quote. my cattle at home are better cared for than these unfortunate persons. Think about that. So, and I love this quote because it really goes with when we started having our dialogue about chattel slavery or American slavery. And so, as you'll see in parts of this presentation, I use a lot of quotes. I try to stimulate folks from all different angles when I talk to them.
Yeah. So oftentimes when we talk about what has happened to Black folks, how did Black people get into this situation that they're in, we always go straight to slavery, right? We think about slavery, but as you and I both know through the work that we do, is that slavery was really an entry point. And honestly, the entry point probably started before slavery with this transatlantic slave trade and the things that happened on the continent that kind of got the ball rolling into this. But the things that took place once enslaved Africans landed in this hemisphere is really what started to mold who we would become now.
Yeah, and it had a massive effect. Like I say to folks, if you got American slavery in your background, and I emphasize American slavery, even though we know that South America, most enslaved Africans, the larger number went to South America. A lot of them were on the different islands, Caribbean islands. American slavery had a little bit more uniqueness to it in terms of, I don't know about the brutality, but the idea of literally treating human beings like property, and literally breeding them and selling them like a commodity or like cattle. So that's why I used the quote I did at the beginning. And so I always want to emphasize that when we're talking about Black people and having that slavery in the background, not that Black people today don't all experience discrimination, no matter if they're immigrants or not. But I always, when I talk to immigrant groups who come to me and talk to me, I said, there's one of the differences is having the humanity of choice. Yeah, a person might have had to immigrate to America because it was so brutal where they came from, and it might have not worked out as well as they thought when they got here, but that humanity of choice is a strong motivator in terms of coming to America and can have a different effect on your experience here in America in some way. But let's get back to the chattel slavery. One of the things that I want to let folks know, as far as I know in terms of the history, the first enslaved Africans was brought here in 1526, and I believe it was in Florida, and they were brought by the Spaniards, and they rebelled and got away. So we're really only talking about the first enslaved Africans who were brought here to the English colonies in 1619. So that's where our starting number is. And, this is 2019. So we're talking about 400 years ago that this happened. Now, one of the other things that come up when I'm talking about this is, that there were free Black folks in America for a long time. So we're just talking about African Americans or enslaved Africans brought to the English colony. And so one of the things I usually try to talk about, because there's so many things you could talk about, is the typical slave family in its form of matriarchal. Because if we look in a lot of sociology books, they'll talk about the Black family being matriarchal, which means a family led by women. But Africans from Africa didn't come here that way. So we know that they came from several different countries in Africa. And, you're talking about patriarchal, talking about countries that were led by women, but it looked much different than what we see here. So how did this become this patriarchal form of the Black family? Well, Black women were an important role to white slave owners for a couple various reasons. And one of the reasons is they kept females pregnated regularly, almost like literally how you breed animals, right? And so that was important. They had, additional babies. They also could work in the field and do those two things. And we were dealing with a white patriarchal system, white male patriarchal system. And in a lot of cases, they were physically scared of these Black males and did not want them to feel like they had any role in being seen as a male or in control whatsoever. And so if we think about Black slave quarters, especially if you had more than one slave or several slaves, there would usually be a spokesman, and that would either be a Black woman or an older Black man, right, who was non-threatening, we sick, master kind of deal. And so think about this. Let's kind of visualize this and let me go through this piece for you. Martha, how's things going on up in here? Oh, master, things are going well, but we might need some more grain. Oh, Martha, you my girl. And will pinch this grown woman on her cheek like she's a child. This particular day, master's in a good mood. So in one corner, we have a little girl named Sally. She's about 9, 10 years old. And in the other corner, or others to the right of him, is his prize buck. And that's what they call male slaves. And not only prize buck, he's prize breeder, as he would call it, right? Well, little Sally's his daughter. And so master says to Martha, Martha, that little girl over there, that little girl Sally, you think she ripe yet? Now, if we can imagine this, how do you think that male slave felt about that incident?
Infuriated.
Right. Yeah, but Martha knows it too, right? And Martha knows that if he does anything to master, everybody pays. And she's trying to avoid that at any means, because she done been put in a position where she is protecting everybody. That little girl over in the corner, who's probably not hers. This the male over to the master's right, who probably has no direct relationship to her other than they're all in the same slave quarters. And in that awkward position, it has been the position for Black women in our history. So she's there, so she has to give this male slave the look. And we all recognize the look. And that look is, don't you dare.
Yeah.
Right? And over time, some of us Black men have learned to resent that, right? That position she's in. So she's in this mediator position, and at times at the cost of her own well-being. Yeah. I know that there's been many slave movies, and there's a scene in The Butler in the field, and the master's son, I believe he is, comes out there and is talking to the male slave, and the little boy's looking at him like, what are you gonna do? Because he takes the boy's mama, and the boy mama tells her mate not to do anything, and he takes her off. You can hear what he does to her, and this little boy is looking at her like, Daddy, ain't you gonna do something, right? And she told her man, don't do anything, right? Even though she knew where she was being taken off to be raped. And again, Black women still feel that position, in that position. And we see it in domestic violence cases. So she got to choose between calling the police, who, don't know what they might do, right? Or dealing with this man's stuff, right? And so, I just started having this conversation about chattel slavery. And what I found is Black women sit in the audience in tears because it was like, what did one woman say? I never had nobody frame it like that for me, right?
Yeah. Wow.
And so that's just one piece of how it shows up now. And so we're talking about separating families for profit and punishment. So if you act up, I sell your children. Then, in the U.S. Constitution, being 3/3 clause, a human being. Now think about this. This is the thing I like bringing up when I'm speaking to mixed audiences.
Mm-hmm.
The system of Black slavery encourages whites to unify around race rather than class. Now think about what we're saying here. We're talking about folks who were in class systems where you might have kings and queens and the commodores, right? The have and have-nots come to America, and as I put it, is you wasn't white until you came to America. You was Irish, you was Italian, but being white has privileges, and I don't think a lot of folks sometimes even think about it like that. But that's, again, a system of Black slavery was encouraged by whites to unify around race than class.
Wow. And, another thing that comes to mind for me with this is the psychological dynamics that take place for all the members who are, involved in these incidents. Not just the fact that you are 3/5 of a human being, but just thinking, what does Sally think in that scenario? What goes through Sally's mind, right? What goes through Sally's siblings' minds who might also overhear or see these things? Like, our psyche is so messed up, and it's been messed up for a long time, and we've just been adapting and trying to survive due to the condition that we've been in. And unfortunately, a lot of the adapting that we've done has manifested itself into what we see now, which is a lot of self-destructive behaviors. But at one point, it did work for us to survive.
Right. Well, the thing is the word that we like to use is resiliency. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have been, and if you look at the definition, what's the definition of resiliency?
I believe it's something like to be able to bounce back from situations, to be able to come back from an adverse experience, etc.
And have adverse experiences and still even be a better person, right?
Yes.
And we are resilient people, and we had to be, because again, one of the things is our experience. If you have slavery in the background, your whole your background experience starts with trauma, right?
Yes.
It starts with trauma, right? So we cannot forget that piece, but we'll talk more about that as we go through, where some of that might have got tripped up along the way.
Right. So Dred Scott, or the Dred Scott decision, which many people are more familiar with this case. So we have Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Why was this important?
Well, basically, why this is important, because this was a landmark decision made by the Supreme Court of the United States, right? The Supreme Court of the United States. And so it held that a Negro whose descendants were imported into the United States and sold as a slave, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore had no standing to sue in the federal court.
Wow.
No standing.
Yeah.
A Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. There's folks who believe that now.
Absolutely. And we see it played out in their actions on a daily basis. And unfortunately, I think we've gotten to a place where a lot of us, we believe this in our actions and in our thought processes, is that we do not have any rights that a white man's bound to respect, and that's why we get what we deserve. And we have people who actually have this type of rhetoric and talk like this all over the place, which is scary when you have a narrative such as that. So after
Right.
slavery ended, something else took place, what we call the Jim Crow South. And I call this Jim Crow-ism because I believe this was a system or a
Right.
systematic method that took place during this time. You want to talk a little bit more about this?
Well, the thing is, we can say Jim Crow South, but we had Jim Crow up north too. It wasn't as, I would say, as brutal. But we had the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, except as a punishment for a crime. That clause, except for the punishment of a crime or for a crime. So it didn't matter what the crime was. So the crime could be loitering. Say you got 3 black men in front of a store, and the store owner calls the police and says you don't want them out in front. And there were certain counties down south that was literally arresting black men and leasing them out to like coal companies and those kind of things. Because you got to understand, after the Civil War, the South was not planning on paying black folks for their labor. And on top of that, they were pretty devastated after the war, on top of that, right? And so they came up with new schemes, like what I call domestic terrorism, right? The Ku Klux Klan, which was started by middle class Confederate veterans, because sometimes folks try to give you this impression that the Klan was started by poor white folks, right? But poor white folks was catching a whole lot of heck at the time too. And so it makes sense that educated middle class individuals would start the Klan because they had the most to lose with this new system. Wow. And so you had that, you had sharecroppers. My grandfather was a sharecropper, another way to impose slavery, a form of slavery. So black folks, it was against the law for them to read my grandfather, Steve, I know I ain't always treated you so well, but this land, as much as yours is mine, and I need your help. Now I can imagine what's going on through his head, but he got 3 kids, 4 kids, got to take care of, ain't got no place else to go, been on the farm forever, and so he said, well, Steve, how about we share in the profits, and I lease you 40 acres in a mule, okay? And he takes this deal and he puts his X on the sheet, but guess what? He can't read it. And so it's his word against the landowner's word at the end of the crop year. And if he can't read, he can see that there was more cotton or whatever was in the field than it was last year, but you still owe master, or not master, I'm sorry, slip of the tongue. You still owe the landowner, and then on top of that, in some counties, blacks could not go in town to get goods. So they had to buy all their goods from the landowner. So, and the rule was, if you owe a landowner, you couldn't leave. So another way of doing that. And I mentioned counting that was done in southern states. And then later on in the 1930s, replaced by the chain gang. Now think about this. 374 state prisoners sold to a company for $5. Do you understand?
Wow.
That a prime breeding male slave was worth $500. You know what kind of money that is in nowadays money, okay?
Wow.
I contend after slavery, a black male body hasn't been much since, unless they're in a factory or in a jail.
Wow.
Now, like I said, I contend, so, that's going on my observation. But the other thing is, and I ask this question, especially when I got a mixed audience. I ask it all the time, but I really ask it, I like to ask it in mixed audience. How is it you can hate somebody so bad who has never done anything to you, and you hang them, you burn them, and you take pieces of them for a trinket, and will have nerve enough to call them a savage? So we're talking about not only lynching men, and when they would lynch black men versus when they would lynch white men, they would castrate them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then they didn't only lynch men, they lynched women and children. But we're a civilized country.
Wow. That's pretty deep. That, especially when you frame it and you say a black male or black female, black folks, we ain't been worth much since slavery. That literally the value of having us went down, 500% from $500 for one. I guess that's more than 500% to $5 for 374. Like that. Man, that puts a lot into perspective of the disrespect, the genocidal nature that we've gone through, and just how who are we and what are we worth to this country if we haven't even been considered citizens of this country, and even when we are mistreated as prisoners or slaves, we weren't even considered well either. It's crazy. Speaking of inconsiderations and
and then
go ahead.
No, I mean, it just reminds me of how folks want to get bent out of shape about Black Lives Matter. Yeah, do they? But moving on, Mr. Emmett Till. So they kill our babies too. My family have slavery, I believe, on both sides of my family, and we're from Charleston, South Carolina. One of the gateways of slavery when it got really going, and on both sides. And I remember when we used to go, because I was raised in Illinois, born in South Carolina, but raised in Illinois. And we would make that 24-hour drive to South Carolina every other year, right? Go down there for a couple weeks, see the family, that kind of stuff. Do you know, I had never seen downtown Charleston when I was a kid because they were scared because we were Northern kids and because of what happened to Emmett Till.
Wow.
I seen downtown Charleston for the first time when I was an adult.
Wow. And this is where your family's from.
And right. Yeah. I drove through downtown, but we had never, stopped and walked around because my aunt, I think, lived on the edge, the dark edge of downtown Charleston, but I had to go down there by myself and really, hang out downtown. But my cousins, they would say, y'all got to know how to talk to white folks down here. They would be scared to take us to the store. So, when I think of Emmett Till, I think about us. And I have the great opportunity to know his cousin. And the last time I talked to her, she asked if we would add Emmett to our presentation. So this is my promised to her. But think about this. 14-year-old boy killed by grown men, after a woman lied on the child. Again, how much can you hate anybody, and a child for that matter? And the thing is when people talk about children, I don't think folks see everybody's children the same. Matter of fact, I know they don't see everybody's children the same. Even to this day, even when you start talking about corrections and we talk about schools and the children is our future. They like using quotes from other cultures to kind of to sound all cute and stuff. But again, as our quote we started out with, how you treat somebody, I know how you make me feel. So we can move on from this one.
So here we have the Great Migration and the introduction to the ghettos. And this phase, I think, is one that doesn't get enough attention. But this is how we understand how Black folks started to become urbanized. Because initially we were very rural people. We didn't really live in cities. It's more of a European kind of concept. And now what has happened during this time is that the economy started to change. So we went from a feudalistic system, and then we started to enter the second industrial revolution. So we started to enter into things like steel and lumber and things like that, and railroads were built, and things started to change. So there you go.
Well, and so the thing is, we got to understand what was the reason for the Great Migration. The reason for the Great Migration was white terrorism. On both sides of my family, I'm part of the Great Migration. I was born to the Great Migration. Remember, I was 6 months old when my family left Charleston, South Carolina to come north. And we lost a property on both sides of my family, right? And you think about this. If you leave the land, you leave the wealth.
Right.
And so folks left them farms and got, in the sharecropping and the abuse, and came up north. They still was abused, because, they didn't get the chance to join unions, so they got paid less, but they had skills. They might not have been able to read and write that well, but they had skills. We're talking about working people. We're not talking about lazy people, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever way you want to put it, at the same time, you had only the Great Migration. You had people migrating here to the United States from other countries at a high rate as well, right? And so end up in segregated housing, even segregated in when we work in employment and those kind of things. So it was for a better life. It wasn't to come up north and live off of nobody. It was for a better life because folks believed in working for a living, right? So it 1915, and actually really continued through the 70s in terms of, because it was two great migrations that went on. Okay, that extended more out west, even up to Minnesota and that kind of thing. 1919. So actually 1917, 1918, and 1919, there was riots going on in a lot of the cities for various reasons, right? Early in the 1970s, there was even riots when Black men tried to enlist into the military service, right? And there was like riots around the country in 28 different cities. But the riots that happened in 1919 are extremely significant because a lot of these riots were right after World War I, because after World War I, the economy changed. It slowed down. You had all these folks coming back from the military, and Black men, not only Black men, but other men of color, but specifically Black men, were told not to wear their uniforms in public after they got back to America. Because Black men felt like, if I fight in the same war you do, drop the same blood you do. And in some of them cases, they dropped even more blood, in terms of how they were used in the military. I be dog if you're going to treat me less than human, right? And they would literally get threatened not to wear their uniforms. And there's been black men hung in them uniforms, them same military uniforms that I hear about right now. Well, you got to respect the uniform. And I do. Right? My uncle was in the military. I got cousins who've been in the military. I respect their service. But America have they always respected our service? Think about it. You literally, so if the uniform is that great, why are you hanging people in it? And the other fear was when the brothers came back, they had their guns. So them, it's like that was the other fear. Historically, we always been afraid of black folks having guns. I contend we're scared of black folks having guns because we think they're going to end up being like them, right? Want to shoot up everybody. The average black person wants you to just leave us alone and treat us like any other human. But yeah, 1919, the Red Summer. Then, okay, so you don't want to live with us. You don't want us in your city. So we started our own cities. And we have this destruction of black cities who are doing economically well, usually better than their neighboring partners or neighboring communities, the white communities. Tulsa, Oklahoma was considered the Black Wall Street, the only city that had dynamite dropped on it from the air. There's a long list of black cities that were destroyed by their white neighbors. And in most cases, some rumor about something happening to a white woman, right? In Tulsa, if I'm not mistaken, elevator operator bumped into a white woman, and a white man seen it from a distance and said he attacked her.
Yep. And that led to the bombing.
Yeah.
Yes. It's crazy.
Then we got the VA loan and the redlining. They're doing the redlining piece was actually backed to some degree. Well, it was backed by the real estate organizations in terms of how to keep people segregated, and then was in some sales contracts that literally you cannot sell your property when you sell it to black folks or other people of color. And they just did they're doing a study or research in terms of looking at that. And so we got redlining. Because of redlining, or one of the reasons in terms of GIs, African American and Native American and other cultures of color did not benefit from the GI Bill as much as the whites did, right? Because they used the redlining codes in terms of if those GIs could get the money or get loans. So there's a speculation that only 0.1 to 0.2% received GI loans. Fought in the same war, brave as anybody else. So,
yeah, and that was a huge factor. I remember watching a documentary in one of my college classes, and they were talking about how the VA loans, or the GI Bill loans,
right.
That would have been the opportunity to really create equality amongst racial groups. But since there was so much racist practice going on, that it didn't even allow for it to happen. Another thing that's important during this phase that we don't always talk about is the invention and the creation of the interstates, and how the interstates helped to break up a lot of these black communities all throughout the United States. Is these interstates were ran right through a lot of the Black communities. And we know about ours here locally in the Twin Cities, the historical Rondo neighborhood, and also part of North Minneapolis as well with 94. But this happened everywhere. St. Louis, happened in Milwaukee, happened in
Well, it's not
Cincinnati, Ohio. Go ahead.
Olsen Highway too.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, to get better access straight to downtown Minneapolis. Yeah.
Right. And so what's interesting about that, I don't know if it's funny, and we call that urban renewal, and I'll deal with a little bit that on reference that in the next slide. But what's interesting is when I travel around the country to speak, and I started noticing when I go around the country to speak that, there would be a Native African-American individual come up to me and says, because I usually don't come back home until the day after my lecture, kind of stick around in the evening. And, they'll say, you want to go to dinner? And I'll say, yeah. And usually we go to dinner fairly early, so it's still light outside, right? And I started realizing that these individuals would take me to the Black community and the freeway and would literally stop at the freeway and tell the story of the Black community before the freeway went through. I think the last time that happened was in Indianapolis, right? And, because, the thing is, if something only happens maybe once, only twice, then it might be an accident. But when it's happening all over the country, that's deliberate, right?
Exactly.
That's deliberate.
Absolutely. All right, one of my favorite documents.
one of now you want to start some stuff. Start some stuff. The conversation in our community over time about the Monahan Report. And, one of the things that when I the findings, the bigger findings that like one, American dream keep.
Can you hear me, Sam? Can you hear me?
The Monahan Report. Yeah, that's a interesting piece to talk about. It's the report. When I talk about it, I talk about the key findings, and the key findings are what African Americans were never accepted into American dream. Matriarchal system does not work within American Western system or American, what are we talking about? American patriarchy, white male patriarchy system. Black men must have employment. Repairing the Black family is key. Now, what I think angers Black researchers and scholars, it might be some other things, but I know for a lot of them, is the fact that the book blames Black folks for this, right? They don't say nothing about all the obstacles that's put in the way for Black families to stay together. All the obstacles put in the way for Black men to be employed. A lot of Black women were employed because they was working in white folks' house. And this whole thing about not being accepted in the American dream. The ironic thing about the American dream is Black folks after slavery believed in the American dream more than white folks did. That's why Black folks made sure they dressed well when they was in public, why they made sure their kids acted well in public. They believed if I do everything that I think white folks want me to do, right, get an education, all that kind of stuff, I will be accepted in America as an equal. mean, they really believe that. And to talk about never being accepted in the American dream, oh. So the thing is they blame it on pathology and not on history, right? Without even considering the trauma. It's interesting how when you want to blame something on the victims of a person, the person in charge's behavior, you forget history. We got amnesia. You know, when folks you don't allow folks to make money, or you don't allow folks to do better, and they utilize services. Now you want to call them lazy. Move on.
So the next area is, the next trauma point is ghetto and the welfare era, which at this point, again, the economy started to shift. We entered the third industrial revolution. Go ahead.
One of the things I probably should, people might eat important pieces or things in our history in America or other, and you're very well right. I just decided to come up with some what I call trauma points to really emphasize how we continuously take these hits, right? And we continue to be resilient and continue to believe in either the American dream or believe that if we work hard and that kind of thing, we will make it. And in these hits, every time our community take these hits, it takes a little bit more to recover, right? So this era is right after the civil rights movement, the second time we was free, okay? And so right after the civil rights movement, you Black folks was allowed to get welfare. And some people believe welfare broke up the Black family because in the 60s, there was 22% of only 22% of children were born to single parent homes in Black community in the 60s, right? And, you know, I never met that many women who had children just to get welfare. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about welfare is 60% of welfare went to white folks.
Still does.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, there's some problems with that, and there's some folks who are stuck in the poverty around welfare. But think about it, they policed welfare differently in the Black community than they did the white community. They had inspections on a regular basis in the Black community. Matter of fact, there'd be little kids looking out for the social workers, like we started looking out for the police during the crack era. Mama, the social workers coming, and these social workers would come in and you would have to hide canned goods. Depending on what mood she was in, they'd come in as like, how can you afford all these canned goods, right? Or how can you afford a toaster? I ain't got no toaster, you know? Because the thing is what I'm finding in doing my work, you know, you can have all these proclamations about equity in an organization, but unless you're going to address middle managers, it ain't going to happen. I've seen so many things stalled by middle managers. And ironically, in a lot of organizations, they know who the middle manager is that is stalling the efforts to change the organization. And this middle manager takes it upon themselves to make sure you people don't forget what they said, this is what I said, because I am here at your house. It was so intentional that we're talking about an era where we didn't have cell phones, and they could come in early in the morning and probably get your grant cut by that afternoon or later that day. You had to hide your Bigfoot child shoes. If you had a boy that wore a size 10, 11 shoe, they swept him down. You had a man in the house. And when I speak to mixed audiences, I ask, since I mentioned that whites get 60% of welfare or more, and how people use policies to mistreat people. It's like being in the line to get your license, and you're having a problem getting your license, and the person has the same exact problem you got. The person at the counter says, well, there's not really a policy for that, but if you do this and this and this, you should be fine, right? You get up to the line, so people can use policies just as well as anything else to discriminate against folks. So after the civil rights movement, we had the exodus of the middle class. Towards the end of this era, the factories started closing. One of the largest factories under one roof, International Harvester, closed in 1975. It was only, I think, the only factory that was larger than it was a General Motors factory. We used to make farm equipment. In the city I was living in, you had International Harvester, you had Farmall, I think you had Alcoa, I know you had Oscar Mayer. All of these factories in a city where I lived, it was like 55,000. Everybody had a job, drove new cars, that kind of thing. Then the factories closed. Now, the important thing about the factories was you had folks making $40 an hour who could barely read. And some of them, and portions of them, did not send their kids to college. And so now you got all these unemployed individuals who are making $40 an hour, not making that. The jobs are gone. You know, we're first to go, last to hire. Middle class is gone. No investment in the infrastructure, because during Reagan era, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in any urban area. If you look at pictures during that time, it looked like war zone in a lot of urban areas, right? And so now you got the folks who couldn't get out. So you got, and then all of a sudden at the same time, during that time, you got Vietnam vets coming back, and some of them strung out on heroin. And then lo and behold, we got all this cocaine coming in on the two East and West Coasts, and we don't have no planes, but we got a lot of drugs coming in.
Right.
You know, so you're talking about a bad mix: unemployment, drug use, military men coming back from Vietnam, and I mean, with many problems. Not a good mix for the community, especially the urban community.
Right. Yeah, we also many of us don't speak Spanish, and we don't have boats or railroad systems or any of these things either.
Yeah, and so then what happened then is, you know, it started, you've seen it more, it started kind of like on the two coasts first, and then it kind of made it here to Minnesota, probably in the late 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. Now you got what we call extreme ghettos, right? Concentration of poverty, underprivileged groups, mass incarceration. We got, I believe that was Uncle Clinton that got us 3 strikes, gave us 3 strikes. And then we got the ultimate, what did they call it? The ultimate predators. They was calling the baby drug dealers. You know, so now we got young people. So let's go back to the OGs, as we call them. You take the OGs off the street, now there ain't no street rules.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
You know, it's like, well, it was, yeah, but still, it existed. People knew it existed. So now the OGs are off the street. There was rules, you know. Then and we're talking about giving folks big time. So it was the amazing thing about this era is I thought crack was something other than cocaine. For a while there, I was like, what is oh, this ain't no freebase, right? And the thing is my new saying is, I'm not scared of the boogeyman. I'm scared of the good-natured people. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the boogeyman, if he scares the good-natured people, they will let him do whatever he wants. Like, so, oh, we got the scourge. I can remember when Daddy Bush had the crack cocaine on his desk. We got the scourge we have to attack. The drug is not in these other folks' community, right? They're scared to death. Now we got 3 strikes, which started, with around there, and it got even further with Clinton. But that war on drugs, and you got the white community scared to death. So now it's like, well, that might be, they're giving them a lot of time, but, they're scary and they're dangerous. You have to do something about that. And, and it was so wild about all of this is because we're such a resilient people, is it got to a point where consequences didn't mean much.
Mm.
When you got a community that's been suffering consequences over and over and over and over again, consequences don't have the effect on folks who ain't scared of consequences. So the other thing about this era is crack cocaine affected Black women or affected women. Now, so why is that important? Black women have been the keeper of the community forever. Because there was always, in a lot of communities, you had these 2 Black women who live in a big house. Nobody really talked about the fact that these 2 Black women lived in this big house, and there was never really a man around, but in this big house. And Miss Mary, if something was going on with somebody's children, those children could go to Miss Mary's house. So say, for example, you got this little girl named Sally. She runs off with some old dude, usually some old dude in a red Cadillac. And somebody says, well, Miss Sally, that girl done left her kids again. And they go get them, she tell her, go get them kids. And they bring the kids to her. She feed them, bathe them, keep them at the house. Girlfriend shows up a couple days later talking about, give me my children. Miss Sally would tell the young lady, well, why don't you come in and we can talk about this and figure out how we can get you some help. And Miss Sally see the old Negro down there in his Cadillac, possibly the check doesn't stop or something. And that whole thing is, Miss Sally's like, look, come on in, let's talk about this. Well, Miss Sally, I got to go. Can you give my kids? And dude, he gets impatient. He rolls up behind the little girl. Old lady, give that girl her children. And Miss Sally might pull out a 38 on him. Right? People know not to mess with Miss Sally. So Black women have always kind of worked together because Black men were in and out of the community. Either they worked like 2.5 jobs, or some of the good jobs was like on the railroad and that kind of stuff. But the stability was the Black woman. And so when crack cocaine affected the women, the children had to defend for themselves. And so now you got the baby gangs. Baby gangs, they're still babies. They're scared to death. They can't show scared to death. Now they all got to have guns, right? They don't shoot straight because they're shooting that stuff running at the same time. Don't trust nobody because we're talking about babies. Then people want to make judgments of these babies. Well, he sold drugs to his mama. Well, he didn't want he was still a baby. He didn't want that mama inside that crack house because he know what was going on in that crack house. Is it right? Nah. But when you persecute people without no understanding, that's what you do, is you end up teaching folks how to be punished. And so anybody under the age of about 40, around 40, 41, when I talk about this era, you can see in the room the pain, because those young people know exactly what I'm talking about. If it didn't happen to them directly, it happened to an auntie, somebody in the neighborhood they respected, and that kind of thing. And as a response to women having issues with drugs was to take their children. That was the punishment. Now, people look at me and roll their eyes, but it sure enough seemed to be that punishment. Took their children, had no place to give, no place to take them. So anybody who had an open space could get the child. And we're talking about child protection. And unfortunately, there was another Black woman in the neighborhood who had a big house that they would call the hotline, would call her. If they had kids they couldn't place, they'd call her and ask her if she had room. And she didn't have no room, but she would never turn them down. And she'd ride around in the community in a mink coat in the summer and also have a red Cadillac. So we got baby gangs shooting each other. Everybody's scared. The older part of the Black community went along with the white politicians because they didn't know what to do. Then we have a concentration of police presence, more gangsters. You know, I'm being nice and saying 25% of them were crooked. I'm just being nice because, you know, barely in public. Because I know the police I knew, shoot, they used to warn them, saying, we're getting ready to do a sweep, stay off of Plymouth Avenue, okay? And then when they made it okay for them to keep whatever they take, oh man, we on a popping now. Oh my God. We still fighting in the Supreme Court on how to get your stuff back when you ain't been charged with nothing. You know, taking the Escalades out of the impound lot to take your girlfriend out and stuff, all that craziness. Popping. And then want to talk about why do you have the relationship you have with the police department? When you forget history, you could ask dumb questions like that.
Man, and this time frame, this period, just set our community in disarray. I see this period as this is when the fabric of the Black community was just kind of worn and ripped and stretched to a point of no return from what it was. And it just wore us out because we had many of our men were displaced through the various different reasons, whether that was due to work, whether that was due to dealing with issues and relationships, and they left the situation due to the newfound acceptance of not even being in the family anymore. And that was just a thing that was okay. And then you have the women, and not all Black women were on crack, but a significant amount were, where it had an impact on everybody. And now you have the kids who are left to fend for themselves. And it created this level of grief and this level of abandonment that I don't think that we honestly look at and talk about, because the pain, and this is my generation, by the way, like the pain of my peers is crazy. We look at how they relate to their parents. The other thing that I wanted to mention was when you talked about the woman who had the home that were taking the kids, the trauma has gotten so deep that is something that those folks are getting old and they're tired and they can't do that no more. So the kids don't have nowhere to go anymore. And some of them, some of the old people who would do that, or some of the people that were part of them homes, have become the old people, and they're not doing that because they don't have the means to take anyone. Right. It's wild.
And the thing is when I talk about these different eras, this is that last major blow to the community. That again, back to that resiliency and recovering and that kind of thing. And what we ended up with is what I call the institutionalized generation. This is something that you coined once you learned more about this. And so we're talking about young people welfare social know their welfare worker name and number, and don't know their parents' name and number. All parts of corrections from juvenile up to adult. So you have a whole bunch of folks who, if it wasn't for some of these social services and stuff, they wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
And then you're talking about institutionalized generation. We're talking about a generation that we want to be together, but we don't even trust each other. Because think about it, if you're a child growing up and you can't trust your parents, right? And you can't trust the folks in your community, what do you do?
You just exist.
And some of us have done well, but the ironic part is even the young people I run into who have got college degrees, might have made a little money, living that middle-class life to a certain degree. When I talk to them, you can hear the sadness and trauma, especially when after they get through hearing this presentation. It's like they're still not happy trying to do all the right things because, again, they can't even trust the folks in their own community and stuff. At least they feel like they can't.
It's deep. It's deep. What has happened is government agencies or community organizations have really stepped in to be the community. And the things that we used to get taken care of at grandma's house or at the neighbor's house now gets taken care of by the Salvation Army or another one of these national kind of places that in like all these agencies, they're all over the place. Minnesota, we have 10 million of them. But what has happened is these institutions have come into our lives and we have adapted and adjusted to them and become dependent in some areas on them for our basic needs survival, which is dangerous.
Yeah, but you also got another group of people who have learned to survive off of nothing.
Speak on that.
Wow. Yeah, well, they've learned to survive, off the hustle. And we're not even talking about necessarily drug dealing or that kind of stuff. This the hustle, right? It might be some social services program or whatever, get a couple $100 a month and that kind of thing, get their TV at the barbershop. They have learned to live off of whatever little bit they can get and make a life out of that, right? And again, that's all part of that ability as a people. The thing is, the good and bad about us in some ways, we have shown we could adapt to anything. I mean, adapt to anything. And we called it resiliency. But now we're at a point where it's like, it's just survival, any means necessary in a certain way. I remember one of my guys in the group, because we talk about trauma in the group, and his grandmother asked him, what are you talking about in that group? Because you seem to be real interested about this group. What they talking about? He tells his grandmother, we talk about trauma and trauma in the Black community and that kind of thing. And his grandmother told him to tell me to quit talking about trauma and quit being negative because we're resilient people, right? So he told me, and I said, good for your grandma. I said, what do you think? What does resiliency look like to you? He told me, he said, we like roaches. We ain't going nowhere. And I'm like, so basically you're saying because they ain't killed us all yet, we winning. And he wasn't telling no joke, because I mean, I've heard jokes about that too, but he was real because he wasn't the only one in the room who thought that. So we spent the rest of the group talking about roach life. How does a roach live? Roach don't care where he sleeps, what he eats, where he lives. And when you turn the lights on, they scatter. And in that same group, there's another little dude, little wiry little dude, maybe barely over 5 foot, always mean mugging people, probably had to do that to survive or whatever. And don't say much in the group, because I don't make my guys talk. I never understood how you're gonna make somebody talk, but when he would talk, you could tell he thought about it. And he raised his hand, he said, what you described as roach life, Mr. Simmons, you know that's the hood. Now think about that. Because I know that people say, I don't know why them children do that kind of stuff in their own community. Did you ever ask them? Did you ever ask them what they think the community think about them? We did a survey in one part of our community about 8 years ago of young people at one of our high schools in what we call the black part of town. And over 50% of the kids said they didn't feel, because they asked them, do you feel safe at home? Do you feel safe in school? Do you feel safe in the neighborhood? In this survey, over 50%, almost over 50% of them said they didn't feel safe in none of those spaces. So how do we respond to that? We can't just respond to that talking about what the man doing.
Yeah, we have to talk about both sides because we got a lot of work to do. So this slide here talks about the African American citizenship. Literally 400 years this year of us fighting for our citizen rights. You want to explain this one?
But this is just an example of, the slide ain't coming in.
It didn't come in on your side?
It just came in.
There you go. I got you.
Okay. Yeah, this slide is just, because when I started doing this particular presentation on historical trauma, there would literally be people talk about, when are you people gonna get over it, right? And I use this slide to show if you got slavery in your background, in your family, we have been enslaved longer than we've been free. Now, do you understand that this year is the 400th anniversary of our enslavement? I don't think people are supposed to be resilient for 400 years.
Wow.
And see, in the citizen rights slide, that's the shadow of Trayvon Martin.
Right. That's the image that's utilized.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Literally, we're not even at the halfway point of the length of chattel slavery. And the crazy thing is, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, is we're only like many of us are 3 generations removed from actual slavery. Some of us are 2, and we have people still alive that are 1 generation removed from slavery.
Right.
And people don't realize that. People feel like 1965 was an extremely long time ago, but when you think about it from a historical standpoint, it wasn't that long ago at all.
Right.
But this is where we're at, still fighting, still struggling, still trying to figure it out. And again, we are adapting to situations. We are not evolving to situations for our survival. So trauma response.
People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. James Baldwin. Okay. So some of my work has been comes from the work Native American woman by the name of Dr. Braveheart. And this is how she displays the effects of historical trauma. First generation post-traumatic stress, and then generations after, they call it unresolved grief or unresolved survivor trauma. And, like identify, victim identity or death identity, preoccupation with trauma, and relational problems. That's a big one. So, yeah. But I believe we have some additional ones coming up here that I think we would find even more clear. Like, for example, increased psychological and physiological symptoms. This is from what we're talking about, long-term trauma. So there's studies that show that due to the long-term trauma, historical trauma of communities like African Americans, Native Americans, that contribute to the amount of diabetes that's in our community. Diabetes, high blood pressure, because of high stress hormones. And there's some belief that that's also what is affecting the infant mortality rate with Black women, is that, because when we're talking about stress has a time limit on it. If it's continuous, it starts to affect our bodies and minds, because it's supposed to get a break from it, right? And if you don't get a break from it, over time, they're finding will have these kind of effects on individual. Another example of trauma response: increased aggression, appearing to be tough as a way to cope with danger by attempting to control one's physical and social environment. So when we were talking about the baby gangs, that really became prevalent, okay? I'm scared to death, so I gotta act tough, and I have to act tougher than the next person, so that means I might have to be more brutal than the next person, okay? Increase the use of alcohol and drugs. I'm a licensed codependency counselor. I don't practice because a lot of the programs I have seen and work with our folks don't do anything around trauma, or not enough around trauma. If we look through our history, we have historically used chemicals and drugs to medicate our stress and our trauma. I know my father used to come home from the factory, and he had to get that first Budweiser. Yeah, he had some chemical problem, but the other thing is he had a 21-year-old white kid who called him boy every day. We're talking about a 49-year-old man who had a little white boy who was like, 21 or whatever, calling him boy every day. And he went to that job so he could take care of his 4 children. Because and we don't only just use drugs and alcohol to medicate ourselves either, but we'll talk more about that as we go. Narrow sense of time, poor sense of the future, frequently view death as an expected outcome. So we got folks in our community who ain't scared of dying. They're scared of living, right? I got young folks who are more concerned how they die than if they die. It's like telling the stupid story of Pookie. Pookie got shot 9 times. I miss Pookie because there's a story behind Pookie's death, right? And, that whole, thing really shows up. One of the things I'm starting to realize because not dealing with trauma is the inability to grieve. When you deal with, in certain communities, when you deal with so much death, if not in your community, but on TV, and there's studies to show that racial trauma has that effect on people because racial trauma is a collective trauma. It's not like an individual trauma. Anybody of that race or community, you feel their trauma, right? Even when you don't want to, because that person looks like you. And when we talk about these like deadly summers in these large cities, one of the things I realize is what they're doing in the summer is regurgitating grief. So think about that. if you got a lot of murders or deaths in the summer, so when the summer comes back around, they start grieving all over again. Their grief starts being triggered, right? The person who kind of clued me into this was a girlfriend of one of my clients several years ago. She said, Mr. Simmons, he get moody around the anniversary of his buddy's death. I said, what do you mean? She said, I was always wondering why, he would be fine. Then there would be certain times of the year you can't deal with him. And I think the last time he did it, I said, what's wrong with you? And he said, well, this is when Johnny was killed, right? Don't you remember when Johnny was killed? And she said, Mr. Simmons, I didn't even like Johnny, because every time he was hanging out with Johnny, he got in trouble. But he got mad because I didn't care about remember Johnny's life, right? That this was the anniversary of his death. And the thing is we're seeing that in the community around that same time. They're sitting around, they missed their buddy, they got a somewhat of an idea who did it or whatever, or what clique might did it, and it gets all what I call regurgitated grief. Because we done, some parts of our community done dealt with so much grief, they don't even know how to grieve. And then it's amazing how many young folks don't believe in nothing about no forgiveness, because they've been given misinformation about forgiveness, so.
Absolutely. We also see this narrow sense of time in what you're expressing about this grief with a lot of the cliques and gang involvement, where we have cliques named after people who've died. We got people who got T-shirts, or they have special events to memorialize what happened. It's fascinating. Or they might make a song about it, and then they're retaliating, and then this continues to feed into the trauma. So, survival stress management.
So basically, this is just what it basically is living in the moment. So, it's like if you use sex for stress management, you're going to have more babies than you can handle. And it don't matter how many sex education classes you go to. When I'm feeling stressed, and not only because they've gotten to a point where they use sex for stress management, they don't even, regular stress, it's just like crack, right? When you first start smoking crack, that first hit is the best hit. The rest of the night or whatever, the rest of your life, you're chasing that next best hit, right? It's always the first hit, best hit. Now we use sex for stress management, regular sex, because you care about somebody, won't be with somebody, ain't good enough. Now we got to flip off the wall, hang from the chandelier, have 3-4 in the bed and all that kind of stuff. That's stress management. When you use sex for stress management, you're going to have more babies than you can handle, because you're going to throw everything, and you're going to be less likely to use condoms because you want the full effect. If you use food for stress management, you ain't eating no salad. You're going to eat the cake. You're going to eat the whole cake in the room by yourself, right? And we know that, when you're doing drugs by yourself, that's a sign. But we got folks who will go in their room when they stressed out and eat that whole cake. They might eat salad in public, but they eat that whole cake, right? And it's living in the moment, and when you get to a point where you live it in the moment and you use these behaviors, you do this stuff without even thinking about consequences at the time. The only time you think about consequences is after the fact. Oh, I wish I shouldn't have done that. When you help folks understand it's interesting, if you help folks understand the connection to trauma in their behavior, they are more likely to start thinking about the consequences beforehand, and it will affect their behavior, right? But when you're on top of that, when you're used to being punished don't stop the behavior. It might curtail it for a while, right? But I know I do domestic violence groups, and I first started doing domestic violence groups. I decided I was going to do them a little different than everybody else, because when they would send the guys to me, they want me to beat them up, punish them, and tell them how awful they are, and they didn't talk about, yeah. But I was dealing with guys who used to be being punished. And so I would tell them, I'm going to teach you how to keep yourself safe. And they looked at me like, what do you mean keep yourself safe? I'm going to teach you how to keep yourself safe. And if I teach you how to keep yourself safe, you won't be in these situations where you feel the need to jump on somebody you say you love. And basically it was talking about them. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about what happened to you. Let's talk about how that affects your relationships. Let's talk about how that affects how you see women. Let's talk about how that even affects how you see your own children and yourself, connecting the dots for them to the point of maybe even realizing that the relationship wasn't good for them or the person they was with, right? Because when we talk about, especially when we talk about the domestic violence, we got young cats who are in relationships with people they don't really know or really care for, other than the fact that she got pregnant and he's trying to have a family because he never had one. So they having the family on the back of babies.
Mm. Wow.
And then on top of that, if they're not in the same house, then, girlfriend, she done had the baby. Dude don't care nothing about her. All he care about is the baby. And she feels like nobody's ever cared about her because we don't talk enough about how single parenting has had on baby girls, especially in the house, the dysfunction we'll be seeing in the house where there's over attention on the boy and no attention to the girl, and the girl be trying to do all the right stuff and get no credit for doing the right stuff, right? And so she's not feeling the love she wants, and so she has this baby lover, or she wants to do the lover and want to make this family, and dude look straight through her at her child, and she realizes he don't care nothing about me. All he care about is this child. And the next thing you know, she does exactly what she said she would never do, is keep the child away from his dad. And we ignore our girls so much in that mix. Because if we're talking about young parents and young women, and next thing you know, there's these conflicts between them and their mama, and they watch how their mama deal with their brother or deal with these men they bring in the house that they have to run away from, who are trying to have sex with them and that kind of stuff. It's like, who's protecting them? Then some of them grow up and think the whole meaning to them is having a man in their mouth, even if it's a piece of man. I've had young women, professional women, bring their men to my group, and dude ain't been out of prison that long. I call prison the shopping center. Like, girlfriend, why are you waiting in the lobby for this fool? Oh, I love him, Mr. Simmons. Can you, if he can't get here on his own, he can't come here. You need to not wait for him. Poor babies.
Man, survival stress management. We are all, victims of it, all a part of it.
So, yeah. So
Dr.
history is not about the past, it's about the present. Yeah, Dr. L. Kate, our one and only professor, not the only, but our homegrown professor here in Minneapolis, in St. Paul. So this is just an example of what we see currently. Adolescence, and this number could go higher than 25, really. But we're talking about generational attachment issues. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm in my mid-60s. The young man that's on this thing with me, you what, junior, mid-30s or something like that?
32. Early
like
30.
I see, barely. But young cats are not trying to hear from old dudes a lot of times. Especially if you're an old dude who keep talking about the good old days and the civil rights movement, all like that, right? They ain't trying to hear that because that's not part of their experience. And if raised in a house where they didn't feel the connection with their parents, they ain't trying to be told about how they should wear their clothes, even though it don't look good or whatever. They want to be loved. They want to be liked. They want to be accepted, But when you putting restriction on your acceptance and your love, And then when they do something, you want to tell them how to do it. Yeah, they can be out there, and you see it all the time. Well, young blood, you probably should have said it like this. Well, okay. And especially for somebody who ain't got nothing, gonna tell some young person how to have something. So there's a generational attachment issue. I call it a generational, not gap, but gulf in terms of movements, and, because I understand it. When you just don't want to be around somebody who's going to tell you what's wrong with you all the time. Projection of confidence while simultaneously masking insecurities. Again, scared to death. Can't show it. Can't share it. Because it's just not safe. Using sex for significance, security, belonging, and power. So we got this issue around trafficking, right? And we did a report in one of the cities about trafficking. And there were some young brothers who didn't realize under the description of trafficking, they were traffickers. Example, because the little young brothers, man, I got women's, yeah, and I got this one girl, she do whatever I say. What do you mean she do whatever you say? Well, if I tell her to go over there and give dude some to get his ties, she'll do that. I said, oh, okay. That's trafficking, right? Oh man, she don't have to do it. That's trafficking, right? Oh man, she don't. Okay. So using sex as power, or using sex to belong to somebody, or to be loved. And then we ain't even talking about the babies who are out there homeless in the street. We're talking about boys and girls. See, we have a tendency to only see girls as victims, but boys and girls are victims of this kind of behavior, right? And then on top of that, the mainstream don't see our kids as important either, but we'll get into more of that. Homicide and glorifying death. So I call it Tupac Biggie syndrome. More important in death than in life. So again, back to how I die and what kind of story I leave, people don't forget me, right? And then when we got and then you got babies who got rooms that is full of rest in peace t-shirts all through their rooms, so they're surrounded by death. Rites of passage involves trauma. So I've got guys, I ask, when did you decide you was a man? Well, man, when I was in front of the judge and I was 16, and he said 8 to 9. Or when my partner was killed, or when my girl said she was pregnant, or when my mama's boyfriend jumped on my mama and I had to get my Glock and threaten to kill him. Rites of passage is not supposed to be about trauma. Historically, rites of passage was supposed to be the celebration of manhood. There is some rites of passage programs still going on around the country, but we also have to address the trauma that is getting in the way of young people being able to love themselves and love other folks, and most of all, being able to trust people around them. The stories I hear from young people, and again, these are even young people who everybody think is doing well, who are doing all the right things, who got good grades. I mean, I listen to my granddaughter about this kind of stuff all the time. We talk about this on a regular basis. She's telling me these stories of the kids she go to school with. And we're talking about she go to school with well-to-do kids. She ain't well-to-do because grandpa ain't, but she go to school with well-to-do children who look like on surface they got everything. But they all, I try to get her not to listen to all of them, but she's like the neighborhood counselor.
Yeah, I want to stress the point that you just said, what you said, starting off about the conversation that happens in between the generations, because you really solidified something to me when when I was working with you early on in my process, when you were talking about how, you have a lot of older, especially black men. You have a lot of older black men that are talking about young men. Like, they just need to pull their pants up, and it's that hard to have a belt on. And then you have said, now these old Negroes need to think about it this way. After he pulls his pants up, then what? You got a job
You're
for him?
going,
You got something else? And
no. Well, you need to do, you probably need to do that again. Or not.
Yeah, so this reminds me what you're speaking about at the beginning. It reminds me of when we worked together and we would talk about that generation gap between young black males and older black men, and we would hear things like older black men saying they just need to pull their pants up and act right. And you had made a comment that I never thought about when you had said, after he pulls his pants up and put a belt on, then what do you have for him? Do you got a job for him? Like, what's next for him? And it was just so I never thought about it like that, because you always just hear the narrative that we just need to pull our pants on up and get a haircut or whatever. But there's nothing after that. It's just telling people what to do without giving them something to actually to do, which is crazy.
And the reason for that, though, the reason for that is it makes us old people uncomfortable when we see it, right? And I remember there was when I was I was speaking out of town, and a gentleman came up to me after I got through speaking. I thought he's going to ask me about the presentation. His question was, older gentleman. He said, "What do you think about young men in their pants sagging?" And I looked at him and I said, "What's it matter to you?" Oh my God! You swear I done cursed him out. What that got to do with it? I said, it's an important question. Why is it so important to you? I said, all I think it is a fad. We had fads. My daddy wouldn't let me wear afro. He didn't want me to wear bell bottoms because he thought that was radical. So I snuck out and wore them anyway with platforms. I know this fad is kind of funky. I don't like it either. But what does it mean to you? Because I think that's more important, is how do you feel about it? And I think if you talk to a young person and tell them how you feel about it, let them know it's about you and not about them as much, they can hear that. Young man, I feel that's just a little bit disrespectful to folks around you. You're disrespecting folks around you when you do that and that kind of thing. But, I'd appreciate it if you would, pull them up at least a little bit, because when you are trying to get people to make changes and it's about you need to let them. And sometimes that's not working. That's not working.
Adultification. Can you share, what does this term mean?
Okay. Adultification. Mature development stage because of the situation or context necessary. So that would be, say you got a single parent and you're the oldest child and you got to take on adult responsibilities because of the situation, right? That's one way to bring them. In other words, you're growing up quicker than you should. But the other one that's real dangerous for Black children or children of color is cultural stereotypes based on how adults perceive children in absence of the knowledge of the child's behavior and verbalization. So basically, there was a study done about Black girls, that Black girls are seen to be less innocent than little white girls, right? And in those attitudes affect the legal system in terms of how they punish kids of color. If I don't treat you like a child and treat you more like an adult, I'm going to charge you like an adult. They had done the same study with black boys. There was a study done that a boy who's 5 years old, folks see him as 12 and find him scary. So if I don't see all children the same, I'm not going to treat them the same. And so if I put adult, if I see them from an adult perspective, older than they are, and that affects how I charge them, how I treat them, what empathy I feel for them. And you can see it, the numbers show it in the research in terms of incarceration, in terms of juvenile, in terms of schools, scared to death of black boys and black girls, call the police on the children, and it is being children. I've had it happen to kids in my family. Had to go have a conversation. Okay. And the trauma continues. The trauma continues. The black women with college degrees had higher rates of infant mortality than white women who were high school dropouts. So education does not improve health outcomes because of the toxic stress that black folks are exposed to. Wow. Blacks and natives are what, 16%, 17% of the population, but 44% of the children in foster care are black and native. Trauma continues.
Wow. And that just highlights the intergenerational trauma and how things are moving. Who's Uncle Big? Where does this quote come from?
The village that hides the truth cannot expect to heal, but to pass on the pain. I met the fella, Uncle Big. Actually, Uncle Big is used to be my street name. So any quote you see with Uncle Big in is a quote of mine. That was my alter ego. Big sexy.
Big
Uncle Big. Yeah.
All right, obstacles.
Back in the day. So obstacles to healing. Well, one is institutional racism still alive and well. But a big one here is obstacles is our community relies on faith, resiliency, and resignation that suffering is part of being a part of Black life, rejecting therapy as a source of strength. In other words, we don't like dealing with our trauma. And it makes sense to me. If you're always seen in a negative light, the last thing you want to do is deal with something that appears to be negative. But if you don't deal with the trauma, then you just kind of get stuck and you kind of get around in the circles. Because I believe the truth is in the dark sometimes. Because, you start going in the dark and find out where them skeletons are. You can start realizing why you might have relationships problems, why in parts of our community we have issues saving money. It's all based in trauma. How we spend money is based in trauma. A lot of things we do is based in trauma and our survival and our need to try to be accepted. The other thing is we have this discriminatory attitude towards men and boys that they can't be seen as victims. If I'm a male and you don't allow me to deal with being a victim or deal with my pain, I'm going to share my pain with you. It's just that simple. Because if I can't deal with my pain, then you're telling me as I'm not as human as you are, and I don't hurt like other human beings be. That's why I even started that whole piece around this whole working with men and Black men around trauma. And then some people working with our folks are ill-equipped to evaluate racial trauma due to their personal history and value system, which lacks their objectivity and their willingness to be uncomfortable. A lot of these folks are non-Black, right? Because for some reason, people in the mainstream thinks that we supposed to make changes, but they ain't supposed to be uncomfortable. It don't work that way.
Wow. Absolutely. So secondary and parallel trauma.
So secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, it's real. That's the trauma you experience when you're dealing with traumatized people if you don't take care of yourself. And if you have a lot of trauma in the environment that you're working in or living in, then it becomes a toxic environment. And folks in that arena cannot heal. Parallel trauma. Parallel trauma is folks who, like, if you're working in an organization or working in a clinic, and majority of the folks or the clients are Black, but probably your bosses might not be or whatever, and you have some of the same trauma, you are affected by that differently than other folks in some cases. So you feel a greater need to fix things. So you work long hours, longer than you should. You invest more than the client. You intervene when you feel like, and not that you shouldn't intervene, when you feel the client is not being treated well, which starts conflicts with staff and the organizational culture, especially if it's not trauma-informed or culturally trauma-informed. And next thing you know, that staff person is gone or you are let go. And, and you get organizations show, I don't know why we can't keep no Black staff, because the environment you running is toxic.
Yeah, I think both of these can apply to people who are not necessarily professionals as well. Like when we have incidents, like when we see police videos of Black people being harmed or murdered, when things like R. Kelly happen, then we have a vicarious trauma that goes through, or parallel trauma, because now you're treating your children differently. You're changing your household based it off of a event or a situation that's getting a lot of media press, and then we end up being re-traumatized due to the exposure of these incidents that we end up seeing. So.
Right. And then the other thing in the Black community, we don't believe in self-care like we should. And part of that is self-care ends up sometime in our families feeling like a personal attack. What I mean by that is you start setting limits on your family, they will persecute you, right? It's like an example, say that you getting ready to have a gathering at your house for the holiday, and you got a sibling who has a drug problem, major drug problem, and you say they can't come, because they steal. They call Nana or Mama. She calls you and says, why can't he come? We don't get together that often, and this is a holiday. Well, Mama, this is my house. If you love me, you let him come. If you don't let him come, I ain't coming. So she beats you down. You say, it's fine. He can come, but he can't bring his girlfriend. He calls Nana or Mama again. Why can't he bring his girlfriend? This is a holiday. Family should be together. If he don't come, I ain't coming. Well, good luck, Grandma. I can't watch two at the same time. And then if you say no to Nana or Grandma, then the rest of the family won't turn on you. And you might be the only one has ever did anything for Grandma and Grandpa, right? But the rest of them have nerve enough to turn on you. So when we talk about self-care, we're really talking about boundaries. One of the things that I think that African-American families in the community suffer from is codependency, or inability to disconnect. And that's a trauma due to slavery too. We came in this country believing that we all have to stick together no matter what, no matter how funky the other person is. And we're still trying to live like that. But we got to believe that we can be happy and we deserve to be happy. Because I think that that whole thing what we had in a slide before, the belief that being Black means you're supposed to suffer, we got to get out of that. Being happy, that you can be Black and happy. Being happy don't make you white. Why is only white people can be happy? We know that some of them are faking, but why other people can only be happy? And sometimes being happy might mean I have to cut some of them folks off.
Absolutely. Boundaries are extremely important. We don't necessarily believe that we should even have them.
Meeting the challenge. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. So as a community, we need to acknowledge and confront our historical trauma, focus on healing oneself as well as healing within among the community. So we're talking about really being honest about the trauma. You know what? Being honest about the trauma we do to each other. We real quick to talk about what somebody else do to us. You know, that's the prime thing of a dysfunctional family. Be beating the snot out of each other, be cheating each other and everything else, and then some outsider come in, and then you all get together and get the fist bumping and giving fives, go get ready to go do the beat down, and then turn around and let the family do the same thing to you. We got to deal with that internal trauma. Do you understand that what kind of power our community have? We dealt with this internal trauma because the system is already using it against us. They're already using it against us. Finding ways to release the pain in healthy ways, like respecting, rituals or cultural forces or spiritual beliefs, or building some new spiritual beliefs and some new cultural practices. Because unfortunately, because we came to this country traumatized, some of the things we call culture is nothing but trauma. So we have the prime opportunity to redevelop and using things from the motherland or whatever we have gathered over the time in our lives that works, that is healthy, to develop a brand new culture and deal with psychological treatment services and culturally sensitive cultural treatment services, like dealing with some of our recent thought leaders around Joy DeGruy and those individuals who are really trying to help us work through some of this. And then the social justice movement is a movement that can be built to lead us to healing as well if it's done right. And then community leaders need to role model the willingness to start this healing journey. You know, start this willingness for this healing journey. We're resilient people. Man, quit trying to shut me down when I start talking about trauma. Well, I don't know why you being so negative. I guess I'm just that way.
And honestly, we have to be negative until, because the negativity, or what's been labeled as negativity or negative comments, is just telling the truth about what's going on in our community. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, right. And we can do it, but we can't do it in the blind, and we can't do it with denial. So we need to promote education and community of the community about the normal responses, the aftermath of trauma. We must do our own work. Us who are in the community, folks are around our community, folks who live in the community. So we're talking about investing in self-care. And then when we're dealing with our white counterparts, we're talking about racial bias. You know what scares me most is a racial white fear. White fear kills Black people. You know, it kills Black people. I'm afraid. Oh, bang. And it's like, think about how a police officer shot somebody. Why'd you shoot him? Because I was afraid for my life. It's you if you're so scared, why you do the job? But what do I know? Educate forces around historical trauma, ACEs, and culturally sensitive trauma inform strategies, and raise awareness around male victims in all aspects and identification. If we can work with our male babies, because since they are always seen as perpetrators, We don't always have to treat them like perpetrators. We can treat them like human beings, but we want everybody else to treat our babies like human beings. We need to too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Systems and policymakers. What are some things they can do?
Oh, man. They can add historical trauma in what they call best practices. Tell me how you can have a best practice if you got to modify 50% to work with a group of people. I'm still waiting for the researchers to tell me that. I asked them, I'm waiting, in our evidence-based practices. We need to teach parents about trauma, their own trauma, and the trauma that because of their trauma, they might be perpetrating on their own children. We found that parents really respect that. Oh, Mr. Simmons, I ain't crazy. This stuff did happen to me. And we need to include fathers. How are we going to talk about families and not include fathers in the programs we do? And then want to talk bad about them when they ain't around. Interesting how that works. Outside organizations outside organizations need to develop authentic relationships with long-term investment in community change. And when I say long-term community, you ever notice that at least here in Minnesota, we have a lot of nonprofits, and a lot of the communities, especially in urban communities, a lot of the organizations in those communities are nonprofit organizations. That's okay, but nonprofit money is start over money because they get refunded every so often. So you got to start, if that program don't get refunded, you got to start over with a new program. Black folks know how to start over. We got to learn how to be successful and sustainable. And interesting, when sustainable money shows up in the Black community, the Black folks have to move. Why can't we do both? And we need to address racism, discrimination, cultural insensitivity among the service providers in systems and law enforcement. True equity. Change does not come without people in power being willing to be uncomfortable. There is no equity if we're not talking about being uncomfortable. There's no comfort in change, not initially. So, he's got this people talk about, we need to think outside the box. No, we need to get out the box. Not think outside the box. We need to get out the box. See, when you think outside the box, it ends up being like a jack in the box. Ooh, I'm scared. Let's close the door. So.
Absolutely. Compassionate accountability.
Okay. So, compassion without accountability is chaos. And we see this in some programs. Unfortunately, I see it a lot in some of the community programs because they're bending over backwards to show compassion to people who don't often get shown compassion. But the problem is there's got to be some accountability in there too, because some of our clients, they will take advantage of you. That's how they've learned to survive. I ain't mad at them. Do you ever heard that thing, don't catch them slipping? Shoot, they probably been taking advantage of situations since they've been little children to eat. But when you don't have no accountability, then you end up with chaos. And then a lot of those programs don't stay open. Accountability without compassion. And that's when all of a sudden we want to hold every Black man or Black woman accountable, but don't hold other folks accountable for the same crime, same problem, same situation. Accountability without compassion is never fair. It's self-serving. And then if you swing back and forth because you've been overly compassionate and somebody upsets you, then you want to be accountable the next minute. That's like dealing with kids. One minute you let them get away with murder, and because they done got away with murder so much, now all of a sudden you want to beat them upside the head. All that do is keep people, that's inconsistent, is unclear, and unfair. And confusing. So compassion accountability is about seeking truth. So seeking truth, that might mean dealing with our trauma, not just the trauma that's being done to us, but the trauma that we do to each other. Understanding, forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean to forgive and forget. Forgiveness does not mean forgive and forget. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about making peace with what happened. Forgiveness is about you. I wish not to be upset with this individual any longer because it's messing with my life. That does not mean that that person can have the same position in your life as they did before. Even if Nana says if you forgive them, you still should let them come to the house. They can't come to my house no more because they steal. Forgiveness is about you. And you might not ever forget. I haven't forgot nothing that's been done to me.
Right.
So much better. Unfortunately, some of the folks I've learned to forgive felt better when I was angry at them. They don't even know how to act. Justice, and we talking about justice for all, not just you, but folks around you, which means there's some responsibility to that. Humility and leaving others in power without blaming or excuses. If you work with people, and you can't find compassion for the folks you work for or work with, you shouldn't work with them. I work with guys that I find, in my mind, somewhat despicable because they're might be sex offenders or whatever, and I work that much harder to show them compassion. Or I get real honest and let folks know I'm not able to work with that individual. But there's not that many folks I haven't been able to work with. Might have to work a little bit harder to show them compassion, and almost all those guys have done well.
Yeah, it's very important that we see that this is a balance between
Right.
accountability and the compassion that we have.
Right. A role model is one who is aware of that the babies are watching and acts accordingly. Uncle Big, there's that dude again. Thank you.
Yes. So we've reached the end. Sam, your information is here on the slides. And again, this is a introduction to the work that is done here. You mentioned the conference, which is coming up this June. What are the dates? June 21st?
Yeah, June 21st and 22nd.
Yep. And that's the 11th annual Black Man Community Empowerment through Black Man Healing Conference. More information can be found at samsimmonsconsulting.com or at healingbrothers.com. Anything else you want to add, Sam, before we check out for tonight?
No. I mean, I can always get further information. I can come where you're at. But this is a passion of mine, and I'm an old dude, and I just want more folks to really do better for themselves, and not continue to allow the trauma to continue to consume or take over their lives, even though they don't realize that it is.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Sam, for your time, and we will check you all out later.